It's the week ending Saturday, the 24th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the charity Oxfam rocked by scandal in Haiti, the UN voting for a ceasefire in Syria, and Stormzy picking up the Brit Award for Best Male Artist. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And with me from the week's digital team are Rebecca Gillie, Jamie Timson and Arion McNicoll. Starting the show this week, drumroll please, is Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's a proportional representation that represents no one.
In the middle of the event, news breaks. For the first time, the far-right Alternative for Germany party has overtaken the SPD in a national poll. The new numbers are a disaster for the party, but the pro-coalition campaign thinks it's best to hold course.
This is the best way to tackle bad poll results, to develop good, concrete policies which improve people's everyday lives. That's why I want us to vote for this and then quickly get a new government, implement policies, and then the SPD will also be stronger again.
That was Lars Klingbeil speaking to Deutsche Welle on Monday. Rebecca, 2 weeks ago on this very podcast, we spoke about the far right gaining ground in Italy. Now you're making us worried about Germany as well.
Yes, well, we were already a bit worried about Germany in the...
Brief history lesson.
Well, we're only going as far back as we're just going as far back as autumn last year.
Oh, okay.
When the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland far-right party, won 13.6% in the German elections, making them the third largest party in Germany. That already had put the cat among the pigeons. Then what happened is we've had almost 5 months without a government because the SPD, who are the second largest party in Germany, their centre-left party, did not want to go back into coalition with Merkel's governing party. It was kind of a Lib Dems 2010 situation where their own grassroots is now really turned against them because they don't want to prop up Merkel's government any longer. And they've finally come to a deal that they are going to go into coalition, but it has to be voted on by the SPD members who are not very happy at all. And so there's no guarantee that they will actually get government. For me, what this really brings up, more so than we've known for a long time that the AfD were a kind of a dangerous rising force in German politics, but also the dangers of the proportional representation system, which is what they have used in Germany for the past, modern decades.
Lots to discuss there. You're essentially saying, if I may just interpret some of what you just said, this isn't necessarily about the rise of the far right. It's kind of about the collapse of the SPD and the other mainstream parties.
It's about what happens in a coalition system when there is a rise of an extremist party of any stripe who nobody wants to work with.
Nonetheless, though, we wouldn't be having this conversation or be worried about it here in Britain if it didn't involve the far right. So let's just talk about them for a second. Jamie, often when far right parties come to prominence, it's because of the economy. But actually, this is because Angela Merkel welcomed in 1 million refugees, isn't it? That's the clear cause and effect here, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. I think the kind of main overview is that, like every other centre-left party, the SPD stopped looking at its voters in the same way that you can see a kind of across Europe. It stopped looking at what was its core demographic, which was working class. In the same way that you would argue that Labour hemorrhaged voters to UKIP, you could see that the SPD did the same. Obviously, Merkel's decision to let in 1 million refugees has put a pressure on infrastructure in Germany, and that certainly seems to be the rise of the party. I think probably what I would say, and I think where maybe we could get into quite a heated debate and discussion, is that I don't think it's a failure of proportional representation that has seen this. I think probably the reason, and we have to realise why, the reason why the AfD have become the main opposition is actually because the parties that could have formed a coalition with Merkel's government, so people like the FDU and the Greens, they were the ones that pulled out first. They said, no, we don't want to be part of a coalition with you. So that's the main reason that the Grand Coalition is the only thing that's come about.
Sure, but that was only able to happen under this system where they have to form a coalition because of proportional representation. I mean, in our system here, the equivalent of the AfD, I mean, I don't want to say that's UKIP because UKIP have never been as extreme as that, but that's the closest thing we've got in mainstream politics, would have at best 2 seats in the House of Commons. They haven't even achieved that at this last election. Whereas in Germany, they are 11%, Arion.
Well, that's true. And simultaneously, I think it's easy to be sympathetic to Martin Schulz and his desire not to just immediately go into coalition again with Merkel at the risk of losing yet more voters. That question of whether proportional representation is to blame, probably yes, but I'd struggle to see why this is necessarily a moment where the whole system is brought into question necessarily, because it has actually been quite functional for a long time. And in fact, looking across to the continent from the UK, we often laud the slightly slower workings of the German political system because they do have this coalition problem that means legislation takes longer, and sometimes that's no bad thing.
When a coalition government works, it works well for the reasons that that you've laid out. There are good things to be drawn from proportional representation as a system, but it is often touted by people in this country who kind of see themselves as politically in the know that this would be a better system. And I think this is what's going on in Germany is a really stark reminder that coalition government has far more inherent risks than the first past the post system. From where we're sitting, I think it's shocking that a country like Germany has gone 5 months without an actual government. In Belgium, they went more than a year, I think, a few years ago, with no government. And I mean, obviously, the infrastructure in Germany is in place. They're not going to fall into anarchy. But at the same time, I think it would be hard for us in this country to imagine going 5 months without knowing who's actually, who the government actually are.
Well, except it's happening in Northern Ireland, isn't it, as we've discussed on the show?
Yeah, so I think that's...
And we do have a government that is propped up by the DUP.
I think that the question is what you want out of a democracy and out of a way to vote people in. And if what you want is to create a form of government that means that the Conservatives can win 31% of the vote and be the people in power and have the majority of the vote, and if that's if you value having one overall ruling party over everything else, then yes, proportional representation isn't for you. However, I really don't see an argument against proportional representation of being like, well, we're afraid of what the people will vote for, so therefore, proportional representation gives too much power to extremist people, or actually, what does it do? It gives the proportional amount of power to extremist parties.
But the problem here is that the AfD is so toxic, because although they got, over 13% of the vote, they didn't get 87% of the vote.
But
the average voter doesn't...
would never be in power. Like, the thing about, if you take Netherlands...
But they might have the deciding vote.
No. If you take Netherlands, for example...
Yes, they might have the deciding vote.
They were not going to be in a coalition. They'll never be in part of a...
But they might have the deciding vote. I mean,
That's...
it's the same as the SNP here, isn't it? I'm not saying the SNP are extremists, but they're a nationalist party and they do get deciding votes in the House of Commons because of the way the numbers stack up. Members of AfD might have a deciding vote in policy.
But who are the AfD going to be in coalition with? Or
I'm not saying they'll be in coalition. I'm saying they might have a deciding vote in Parliament, and that's a result of proportional representation.
In addition to this, Germany doesn't have an official opposition because of the proportional representation system. But the thing is that the SPD was in a real rock and hard place situation, because if they didn't go into coalition, then there would be no government. But if they do go into coalition, they are making the AfD the de facto opposition, which means they do get certain privileges. Like whenever Angela Merkel makes a statement in the Bundestag, they will have the privilege of first reply. They will have the privilege of opening budgetary debates, etc. So they have been put into this glorified position.
I agree, but if there is with this idea of having proportional representation in power, you would have a situation where, yes, the AfD are the opposition, but they are only there because of the other parties standing back and saying this isn't something that would happen again and again through proportional representation.
I think that people who advocate either for or against proportional representation often think that we have to choose between either that or some other system. But actually, looking at a voting system like Australia has, we have two houses that each have a different voting system to elect them. So
it's when it suits you, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But the lower house has a majority preferential single member seat system, and then the upper house is PR. So you can get a stable two-party system in the lower house where the Prime Minister is drawn from, and then have a check and or balance coming from the Senate, the upper house, which is PR. So I think that actually you don't have to choose necessarily, and both systems can work quite well together.
But European democracy is under a lot of strain, Rebecca, and that is happening everywhere. Arguably is why we have President Macron in France, even though a lot of the people who obviously aren't very keen on AfD rather like Macron. And, we've got fringe politicians in Italy and Greece and, arguably in Britain, the DUP running the country. So is this just a moment of history and that is the way the tide is? And actually, it's not about the political system, it's about upheaval.
What it's about is, what does a system like PR do when a faction which the majority of people find morally repugnant becomes sufficiently powerful to demand a place? The AFD have got such a large chunk of votes that really, even though it kind of sort of hurts my progressive heart to say it, why shouldn't they have 13% of the power? The other parties don't want to give it to them for obvious reasons, and the majority of German voters probably don't want them to have it either. But the point of proportional representation, it's in the name. They are entitled under that system to their fair share of power. But now they're up against this brick wall of, well, what do we do when a party we really, really don't want gets it?
I don't think there's like a logical argument for not giving them 13% of the power.
Well, because Hitler, in a word, is a logical argument, isn't it?
But it's not. But if the number of people have voted for...
Yeah, people voted for Hitler, but it's still a reasonable... I don't intend to shut down the argument in the way that people do with the mention of Hitler. But if you're talking about Germany and voting for extremists, that's the answer as to why people are cautious, isn't it? But it's a reasonable lesson to learn.
In Germany, they have a 5% threshold that's meant to weed out fringe, and so you have to get 5% of the vote before you can get place in the legislature. And so giving a party like AfD 13% of the power will not lead to Hitler. That's a full stop fact, right? But you can say that if we see the AfD growing in Germany and if Germans see AfD becoming more and more powerful, they then have to deal with and engage with the ideas of why this is happening. Shutting themselves off, this is the argument about France as well. So France have the two-stage system, right, where their Front National can get into a second runoff, but they never win the final thing because people go, whoa, when they're placed up against one other person, they vote them down. But that doesn't do anything to stop the ideas behind it. If anything, that just represses it and makes it grow further. And so what you need to say, look, let's have these people who may have morally repugnant ideas put in a place where they have 13% of the power, and then we can show everyone and people can learn that this isn't what we want.
Jamie, I'm going to put your ideas, repugnant or otherwise, to one side and ask you what your story of the week is. You're next.
Instead of 12 years a slave, it was 30.
To me, the really important thing is, how do you respect this person on the street? And the way you respect this person on the street is to try and get them off the street. You have to help them exit the street. And the real problem is that everybody, homeless organisations, the government, are not doing the real work. The homeless organisations, because they don't have the means, they don't have the money. The government, because it's very, very confused. I'm an ex-offender, ex-rough sleeper, ex-beggar. And I tell you, the worst thing about being a beggar is the fact that you hate the people who give you money and you loathe the people who don't give you money. So it's a real mind screw.
So you're feeling resentful about everybody?
It's absolutely terrible to be on those streets.
Lord John Bird there, the founder of Big Issue magazine, talking this week on ITV's Good Morning Britain. Jamie, why have rough sleepers been in the news this week?
This week saw an investigation by BuzzFeed News that highlighted the real shocking movement from rough sleepers into modern-day slavery. It gave quite a kind of harrowing example of a man who had been tempted away from Poland under the promise of employment and money to the UK, and he'd fallen into the hands of what was quite a brutal human trafficking ring. Theresa May had made modern slavery a big bastion of her government since she came into power, and she came up with this new ruling that if you were a victim of modern slavery, you would be given, regardless of who you are, you would be given 2 weeks in a safe house. He went forward, this guy who'd spent 30 years basically in what is effectively modern slavery. He went,
and that's being forced into labour, basically, being forced to work on building sites and whatever.
And kind of very minimal pay, being trapped. He gave examples of running away from one group, but then obviously not having the means to be able to find anywhere to sleep, so he would be picked up again by other people offering work, and a kind of a real seedy underworld that I'm not sure many people, certainly I wasn't particularly hugely aware of. But he got this status that said from the Home Office that said he was a victim of modern slavery, and he would have 2 weeks in the safe house and to help himself get together, and then he got a letter for deportation
because he was a foreign national,
because he was an immigrant who couldn't prove that he had any gainful employment. And one of the things that Theresa May has brought in is to create a hostile environment for illegal immigrants, and he was obviously an illegal immigrant who wasn't welcome in the UK.
I mean, that's an outrageous story, and I read the coverage in BuzzFeed as well, but I mean, it seems clear that's not the intention, obviously, of the anti-human trafficking legislation. This is an example of someone falling down between two different, protective mechanisms, isn't it? One, to make sure that migrants get legal work, and one to make sure that people don't get trafficked.
It's quite a large example. So only 12...
It's unfortunate. He's probably not going to get deported, is he? Probably someone
not
sympathetic
now,
would look at
no.
him.
So probably not now. But only 12% of the victims of trafficking, the Home Office acceptors genuinely currently have leave to remain. So there is 88% of people who don't have leave to remain who are victims of trafficking. And that's like a vast majority. But I think what's interesting, and I think because we could all sit here and say, oh, this is a terrible case. But what I think would be interesting in terms of the discussion is about what we do in the UK about homelessness.
OK, what do we do in the UK about homelessness? Rebecca?
Well, not enough seems to be the consensus. Homelessness has shot up. I mean, even anecdotally, I'm sure the average Brit walking along the town centre will have noticed a huge uptick in the amount of rough sleepers and beggars, etc. And so, yes, it is the case of what do we do about it.
It's also what aren't we doing now that we did do before? Because as you say, there's been, I've got the figures here actually, there were 500 people sleeping rough every night in 2004. And in 2016, that's gone up to over 4,000.
Yeah.
So yes, we've had some more migration to the country, but that shouldn't really account for that number.
I mean, it's a combination of factors. Austerity affecting social services, so people are falling through the cracks. Changes to benefit systems is putting people out of their homes. The end of private tenancies is the leading cause of homelessness in the UK.
Exactly. Yeah, broken housing market, massive problem. But also another legislative issue is the Localism Act from 2011, which stipulated that social housing was only available to people with a 5-year connection to a borough, which meant that people who get into housing difficulties or end up in emergency housing or even on the streets then have to be able to prove that they have a connection to the borough in which they have been residing for longer than 5 years to be eligible to get back out of that system. So a lot of people fell through another massive crack that was built into the system.
It's all cracks.
It's a system replete with cracks. And I think that's kind of the problem, that massive patching up needs to be done if we're going to solve the problem.
OK, but that's we as the British government, right? Yeah. But we as individuals can patch up those cracks, either by giving money directly to homeless people or by supporting homeless charities or helping out in soup kitchens or whatever. Where do you stand on that? Because it is one of the sort of classic middle-class dilemmas, isn't it? Do I give money to this bloke if he's going to go and buy heroin with me?
And I think that's towards the end of last year, there was an article that went viral that said that you should give directly to homeless at every opportunity that you can.
Yeah, this is a piece in the New Statesman.
Yeah, by Matt Broomfield, who's an activist and journalist. I mean, his argument was quite clear, and it was basically saying that addiction is rooted in material circumstance rather than anything else. So if you are worried that this person is going to go and spend that on drink, it's completely up to them. You are taking away the last vestiges of agency that they have, particularly when you think about rough sleepers as being probably, studies have shown this is when they're at their lowest ebb. People don't go to begging straight away. Begging is something, despite all of the, what I would describe as myths, but I'm sure there are cases of people, choosing to beg because they've got jobs on the other side. But those are kind of outliers in a system where people really they don't want to be rough sleeping.
Yeah, but that is bollocks, though, isn't it? I mean, don't you think, Rebecca, this issue of... I mean, we've just had this scandal with Oxfam, right? People are saying, I resent the fact that I've given money to an aid agency and then people acting on behalf of that aid agency are using prostitutes and that doesn't tally with my ethical beliefs. If you give money to someone to help them and they further harm themselves, I'm not saying you blame the person who's obviously, in a cycle of drug addiction, but it is reasonable to say I would rather that they spent that on getting shelter.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you could not have asked a better person in this group about this. I was just saying, we've been talking about this, earlier in the week when this BuzzFeed investigation, we started talking about the New Statesman article. And I just think the idea that you don't care what the person spends it on, it's just an example of shocking 21st century moral laxity. It's the equivalent of if someone's standing on top of a building threatening to jump, you say, go on, get on with it, mate. And then walking away saying, well, they might have done it anyway. It's ridiculous. It's like, you can't, yes, I can see the temptation. If someone comes up to you, they look desperate. You want to just, bring a moment of hope into what is probably a pretty grim existence.
And if they're asking for the money, if they're begging, if they're humiliating themselves, maybe they need it.
Whether or not they spend it, maybe they'll spend it on a sandwich, maybe they'll spend it on heroin. But either way, you're not actually helping, you're really making yourself feel good. You're like the dad who turns up once every 6 months, takes the kids to Disneyland and then doesn't show up for any parents' evenings. You're not, arguably, you are bringing a moment of happiness into their into their lives. But you're not tackling the root problem of homelessness.
But you are giving them a sandwich. In that literal sense, you are helping them.
These sorts of people, like Matt Broomfield, they'd rather that you didn't give them a sandwich because you'd be taking away their agency to
He
go
said
and
in that
buy their own
article,
sandwich.
don't buy them a sandwich from Pret, they're not for.
I was walking down the street the other day. There's a homeless man who sets up shop kind of opposite the tube station where I live, and I saw him just rip open this big bag of crisps and just empty them all over the street. I think what he was probably doing was like feeding the birds, like just as kind of entertainment purpose. But again, it's not like the average homeless person, especially in London, is not short of people giving them sandwiches.
I think that the thing about the kind of the parallels to being a kind of dad that only turns up every 6 months or something like that is the argument that Matt Broomfield is making is that you should give every day, right? If you can spare it, if you can, then you should give to people directly every day. And I don't think that that's a bad idea. I can't agree with the argument, particularly when we know, for instance, St Mungo's has a contract called Roots Home, where it has a target for the number of people not returning to sleep rough in London. St Mungo's is one of the biggest homeless charities. So if you think that it's better to give to homeless charities, these homeless charities are sharing their database of rough sleepers with the Home Office, and those Home Office are then deporting these people. You can pick the charities that you think are the best to give to, but giving directly to the person will make a difference to that person then, in that moment.
I think that's right, and I think that there's two levels on which we can help, both individually by giving, and everyone's going to make that choice for themselves. Some people may think that it's not sensible, others are going to think that it does help. I happen to think that it probably will help, at least to give that person some sustenance, whatever they need that day. But the second level, I think, is on a sort of more macro social level. And there's one country within the EU that has reversed its homelessness program. And I know I keep talking about Scandinavia as the example that we should follow in all things. But Finland introduced this housing first policy that's almost eradicated homelessness altogether, where basically anyone who is living on the streets immediately gets put into a house. And that solves the problem. It is complicated, of course, because what it does is it knocks out the mid-level of dormitory-type hostel accommodation and turns that over completely to actual housing. So that, of course, there are limits to how much you can do.
We don't have 4,000 homes right now.
No, we don't. So you do need to repurpose short-term accommodation. But actually, the argument goes, and what Finland has shown, that by doing that, you can actually solve the problem altogether.
You're solving the problem of people literally being on the streets, but you're not resolving their psychological issues. You're not helping them find the next step in society. You're just literally putting a roof over their heads.
That's right. And often the argument that's made by governments is that you need to get people who are on the streets to show you that they've got a job or that they are dealing with their drug addictions, and then you'll put them into a home. But actually, the Finnish argument puts that case the other way around and says you give them the home and then they can start to solve the other problems.
Okay, we should mention as well Marcos Amaral Gurgel, who's this guy who was sleeping rough outside Parliament for years and then died this week. Jeremy Corbyn highlighted his death, and then it was reported that Gurgel was a convicted sex offender. People's views on homeless people can shift very easily, can't they?
So this is one example of a homeless person who clearly had issues and had caused crime. I think that the fact that I saw that the Telegraph tried to paint it as the homeless person that Jeremy Corbyn lionised turned out to be a sex offender. So it's clear that there is a political motive in some of the ways that people are discussing homelessness. But I think at the end of the day, it is something that homelessness on the rise is something that's affecting everyone, certainly everyone's mental health. It is a topic that comes up in discussion amongst my friends more and more often than it ever did before. And so I think that things are going to change.
And that case really speaks to the broader problem of dealing with homelessness, especially with pushing government initiatives that need to win the support of the electorate, which is that the homeless population isn't always the most visibly sympathetic. You've got people dealing with drug addiction, alcohol addiction, which does often make people very unsympathetic to the average person. Mental health issues, crime occasionally. And that makes it such a complicated issue. So, a lot of the solutions that people think of, there are enough places, we keep hearing in hostels, that no one has to sleep on the streets. But the rules in place around drug use, sometimes around pets and things, make it so people don't take up on those offers, which then pushes the average person to think, well, if they would all just go in the shelters, then they wouldn't be sleeping on the streets. It just makes it that much more difficult to solve.
Deserving and undeserving poor, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Is that the government has pushed this idea of those that are deserving of our help and those who are undeserving, when actually that's, for me at least, not the case at all.
Yeah, but then the only constituency with a Green Party MP has the biggest problem in homelessness in the country, doesn't it?
Those two things.
You can have a very liberal attitude towards homelessness and attract.
Surely.
You can have a very liberal attitude towards homelessness and attract more homeless people.
Yeah, of course.
But it doesn't necessarily deal with the problem.
No, but there's nothing Caroline Lucas can do about the government's measures in terms of austerity and everything else.
Finally, this week, it's Arion. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I'm wondering whether we should now take it as read that ebooks are dead.
Well, it's really strange. I was in a school last week and I was speaking to a young boy and he was 11 years old and I said, what do you prefer? Do you prefer it on your iPad or a book? He went, oh, no, I prefer a book. I said, why? He said, you can smell them.
There is hope.
There's hope, yeah, and he loved it. You can open them and you can flick through the pages, and he said he liked that. The spines never got creased. And you could see the look in this boy's face as he was animated about being able to hold a book.
Children's author G.P. Taylor there, speaking to the BBC back in 2015. Arion, what's happened this week in the world of ebooks?
This week, the CEO of Hachette Livre, one of the biggest publishers in the world, the CEO Arnaud...
Hatchet, I'd call it.
Yeah, that'll do. The CEO, Arnaud Nouri, described ebooks as stupid. He went on to say that they have no creativity, they offer no enhancements, and there's no real digital experience that they offer. It was an attack that sort of came out of the blue and is unexpected, coming from a person whose life is books and in all their various varieties.
Is it unexpected that people who work in publishing, have had to tolerate making ebooks but don't really like them? We all know that people who choose to work in print love print.
I guess so, but at the same time, even though it's true ebook sales are decreasing and have done since 2014, it's still...
Did you know that? Digital team?
I could have just guessed that they'd gone down, but I wouldn't have said.
Yeah, I would have suspected from the 2 Kindles I have lying dead at home.
Yeah, okay. I've got a Kobo just to provide balance that's also lying dead at home. I'm surprised people aren't buying ebooks like they did. But anyway, carry on, Arion.
Well, I was just going to say that I do think it's surprising that Nouri made this attack, just because even though, yes, people may have this emotional connection to print and the written word, actually, it's a very lucrative area of sales, even through the decline. So it seems strange for someone who's in the industry to attack it, And so that seemed curious to me.
Well, it's lucrative, I guess, because the profit margin is so much, because you don't have to actually literally print anything.
Exactly.
But equally, it's much higher risk of piracy, isn't it? Although your profit margin's high when people actually buy it, by the time you've made an electronic copy of it, that can be distributed and hacked. You're actually losing potential sales.
I suppose so, but I don't think that the ebook industry or the publishing industry has been hit as hard as, say, the music industry was by piracy. I certainly never thought to get an illegal ebook.
What about Fire and the Fury by Michael Wolff? Because WikiLeaks basically leaked the Trump book early, didn't they? And I know a lot of people who downloaded it.
That's true, but were there any other books in the history of books that were anticipated?
Keep going.
And then, trailed and poured over
I also think
prior to their actual publication.
The trailing thing is interesting because it's that idea of, particularly with books where something like that, I'd read the majority of it in New York Post or online, certainly before it had even come out. So maybe he wasn't really expecting... That was always going to sell well, so maybe that's not a great example of...
I think that's right. And I think that the other thing that's curious about Nouri's suggestion is that no innovation has been done with digital versions of books. And actually, there's all sorts of things that ebooks offer that print books can't, like a dictionary at your fingertips, the ability to share passages on social media, even the simple capacity to change the font size for people who have sight problems. It's a massive development and offers a great advantage that lots of people have taken advantage of.
Rebecca, is it just as simple as it's not as pleasant as reading it on paper? It's something long form, the screens are good, aren't they? They're really good. E-ink is good. It's better than it used to be, but it's still not as nice as print.
No, of course not. I would say for me, it's probably the case of the novelty wearing off. There are lots of really great things about ebooks, especially if you're on holiday, because the page doesn't become blindingly white in the sun. It's much easier to hold above your head when you're sunbathing on your back without your arm getting tired. But these are relatively small considerations, in the overall picture. I have to say for me, it was probably, I think the moment when I switched off ebooks really was I was reading the first of of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, My Brilliant Friend, a book which, if you've read it, you'll know has a bazillion different characters, to the point where it actually has a character list in the start, so you can keep flicking back and checking whether it's Antonio, Alfonso, or,
The last ebook
one.
I read was that expose about Simon Cowell. But anyway, carry on.
Well, I imagine that was a very similar scenario, juggling so many characters. And I realised reading it on an ebook, it was actually really cumbersome and annoying to have to try and get back to the start of the book to check on a character. And it's the same, even if you're thinking about, oh, I remember there was this passage earlier in the book, let me just look it up for you. It's so much easier to do that with your hand still than fanning about with your fingers on the screen trying to look it up.
That's true, and there are some books that simply will never work as ebooks, at least as we currently know them. Like children's books, they need the illustrations, they need the tactile experience, they need to be drooled on and ripped apart. Cookbooks as well, they are an experience that will never be replicated.
Okay, but you're doing Nuri's work for him here. I mean, it's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? Shouldn't publishers be trying to meet the challenge of the digital world? Shouldn't publishers be saying, okay, maybe we failed so far to create an interesting ebook, but that is still there to be cracked?
I'm certain that they'll do new technologies, Part of the thing about books was the whole social status thing, the idea of libraries full of books that maybe some you haven't read, or when you went to university, I put books up there that I'd never read before in my life and probably still won't. But it is that idea of, having these like books as being like, this is the kind of person that I am. And ebooks can't replicate that, but there will come a time when they can, right? So when you can have up on the wall like a hologram display of the things that you're latestly reading, or iPads
that literally will never happen.
But like,
you just invented a thing that won't happen, and then made it sound like it will.
That's the flip side of everything that, all the things we've been saying. We were obviously, all of us here, brought up on print books. The flip side of us saying, well, ebooks can't do this, is ebooks can do lots of things, but we just don't really know what they are yet. We've got no framework to understand where the publishing industry could go.
And vinyl.
And I wonder whether that's what Nuri was really getting at, actually. I wonder whether he was trying to spur ebook writers and creators to be more original, be more creative, and try to
do my hologram thing,
and try to do Jamie's hologram thing, for example.
Isn't the truth of it the traditional publishers, and he's put his finger on this, just aren't the people, as I was saying earlier, if you get into print it's because you love print, they just aren't the people to embrace the digital world, and people from Silicon Valley are. And so if you look at something like Lonely Planet, for example, I'm of the generation, if I go to a place on holiday for more than a week, I still want to go to the library and get the Lonely Planet, even if it's 5 years old, because I like the paper copy. There should be an app, there probably is, that's as good as that. But if I want the app version, I'd obviously open TripAdvisor. I wouldn't trust the Lonely Planet people to be doing an app that's as good as what you can get for free off the internet.
Maybe what will happen is you'll see a certain amount of innovation going on in the world of books. And you have already. There are some interactive video games that are largely text-based and allow you to determine the trajectory of the character's journey and so on. But I suppose the question then becomes, when does it stop being a book? And I think ebooks put a lot of effort into creating an experience that was quite book-like. The print is at the heart of the experience that you have there, and it's really not trying to do terribly much other than present words the way that books present words. It has a page flip. They're kind of emulating books. If developers were to take Nuri up on his challenge, if you'd end up with something that's just very unbook-like at the end.
Yeah, exactly. It gives me a kind of sense of unease. I feel like everything these days turns into a multimedia event. Everything's got an app or a web tie-in or something that you've got.
The future, man.
I know, something you've got
Get in the hologram craze.
Scan with a scanner on your phone and all this kind of thing. And I think that at the heart of reading, people do enjoy the kind of quiet, meditational, private nature of it. You can't really sink into a book if you're going to have to follow links and have holograms and things popping up. That kind of takes away from the essential pleasure of reading, which
it's
I think...
tactile, isn't it? That's the thing.
You know what is weird about publishing industry, apart from in cookery books? Hardback. Like, how's that still a thing? Like, if we clearly what people want is airport paperbacks, isn't it? That's what they want.
Yeah.
Why don't they just charge more for the paperback for the first year?
The hardback is great for the bookshelf boasting purposes. Though.
Oh, sure,
it
for
tells
propping
people
open a
that you're very
door,
serious.
it's great. But to actually read...
Oh yeah, no. This is the thing. People read so much on the go now. We're such a constantly in motion society that hardback books don't really have an excellent place in it. But they do have that, as we were saying, they do have that presentational kind of impressive status that you also don't get from an ebook.
That's true.
You get a final line on this, Jamie. You're about to say something very wise, and it's going to sum up everything.
Okay, well, I finished a book recently that I didn't like halfway through, only because it fit in my pocket.
There we go. That's it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jamie Timson and Rebecca Gillie and Arion McNicoll. For more from us here at The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk. It is electronic. It does have words. You can also sign up there for our free email newsletter, The Weekday. Or, of course, you can have the magazine delivered direct to your door. If you're a print fan, just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And if you want more from us, well, just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice, hit subscribe, and then lie back. It even works on your sun lounger, doesn't it, Rebecca?
It does indeed.
It doesn't matter what you're doing with your arms. Think about that. I've been Olly Mann. Thanks to David Hutchinson for our brand new logo. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer is Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.